Hello, good people, and welcome to Finance Skills Hub. Here we learn, we connect, and we grow. This is an interesting video. We want to build a full balance sheet dashboard in Excel. This is going to be a step-by-step guide showing you how you can take your trial balance data, close your accounts, calculate retained earnings, adjust your trial balance, and then use these numbers to create a dynamic interactive dashboard in Excel. We are going to use all the tools. So we use Power Query to do all the transformations, Power Pivot to create our data model, calculate DAX formulas, and we'll round it all up with PivotTable slices to be able to create one interactive, beautiful dashboard in Excel. The way we are going to create this, it is going to be reusable. So in subsequent years, you just have to post in the trial balance numbers, refresh, and then you have your balance sheet numbers. As we always do, we'll share the start file with you so you can practice step by step. So if you're game, join me in Excel and let's get started. Okay, so we are going to begin the journey with two data sets, a trial balance and the chart of accounts. Okay, so this is very typical of accounting systems. We have accounting code, we have account, and the trial balance is posted on a monthly basis, right? Now, if you're conversant with how this works, you realize that for the income statement lines, which in our case starts from 100 all the way to 6010, right? These numbers are on a monthly basis. But for the balance sheet numbers, starting from 10,000 upwards, right? These numbers are assets, the months, right? So we'll have to take note of this as we go about building our balance sheet. Now, one thing that we need to pay attention to is the treatment of retained earnings. Okay, so if you look at the starting data set, we have a flat retained earnings going through January to December. What we need to do is to be able to calculate the profit or loss for each month and post it to the retained earnings, and then also create a cumulative sum or aggregate that will give us the total retained earnings at the end of the year. Okay, but we are going to do all this using Power Query. So as we have it now, if your data is similar to this, we are going to use Power Query to transform the data to first take care of the treatment of the retained earnings and to be able to create that cumulative sum, which we'll use to adjust our trial balance. Then we also have our chart of accounts. So we have our account code, and then we have the details for each account code. So that is also here. We have another column that helps us separate whether it's an income statement or a balance sheet account. Then we have categories. Okay, so this category basically has assets, cost of goods sold, equity, expenses, liabilities, and revenue, right? This is further broken down into subcategories. Right, these details are what we use to create our balance sheet, and then another column for debit or credit. So it depends on the shape of your chart of accounts, but ideally we expect at least most of these columns to be present, giving us further and better details of each account code. So we are going to work with these two data sets. We'll do some basic calculations. So we'll draw our pivot tables from our DAX calculations and our cube formulas, and eventually build this interactive dashboard. At the heart of this dashboard is the ability to compare your current and previous numbers for all the balance sheet lines. So as you can see here, I have my asset lines here. I'm able to break it down. I have my current and previous, and then calculate variance for each line. Okay, so I have some data bars here. The red for negative variance and then the green for positive variance. Same for our equity, and then we have our liability. So for our balance sheets, we expect the final check to be 0 for the formula for assets, equity, and liability. So this is at the heart of our dashboard. Now, apart from seeing this, you also have the opportunity to view this by month. So you can go back in time. Okay, so you have these slices here to give you the picture as at this point where you selected on the slicer, right? So if you are able to see and compare, you can also go back to any point in the year. Now, To the right, we have some key indicators usually good for decision making or for looking at the health of the business. So we've drawn debt to equity, which also responds to the month slicer. Okay, and then we also have this visual showing the working capital, which basically is the current assets minus liabilities. It shows us the working capital for each month as well. And then for changes in working capital, we've used this waterfall chart to show us the movements between each month. So green for positive movements and then red for where working capital went down. So basically we've covered the key balance sheet indicators for checking the overall health of your business. So now that we understand what this dashboard is, let's look at the schema or the step-by-step guide to build this from scratch. Okay, so we begin with the trial balance and the chart of accounts. Now we are going to convert these into tables. Makes it easier to use the names in our calculations in Power Query and in the Power Pivot data model. So after we convert these to tables, we'll do some work in Power Query. Now, as I indicated, we are going to basically close the account. So at the end of the year or at the end of every period, we need to close each account. We'll do that in Power Query. Then we will post the profit or loss after summing all the lines in the income statement to retained earnings. Again, we are going to do this in Power Query. Then we post these two, that is the closed accounts and then the retained earnings queries to adjust our original trial balance. So if we adjust our trial balance, it should now have what we can take to the balance sheet. So all these are going to be done in Power Query. Then after we are done, we'll draw 2 dimension tables, the calendar table, which will give us a date dimension, and the chart of accounts that we brought along. So the 3 yellow dotted tables are what we are going to use to go to Power Pivot and then create a data model. So these 3 will now form the foundation to build our balance sheet dashboard. From here, we are going to create pivot tables that will be relying on DAX calculations and cube formulas to be able to create that dynamic interactive feel that you saw earlier. And when we are done, we'll create our charts, use our slicers to create our dashboard. Now, the way we are going to create this can be used as an annual template. So if you run it for a particular period, you can always reset and then post in new figures to update the template. So you can run it year on refresh. So we are going to go through all these steps one by one. As usual, we'll share the start workbook with you so you can come along step by step. So if you're again, join me in Excel and let's get started. Okay, so we begin with our start worksheet. And as I indicated, these are already tables. So you know they are tables when you see the table design tab here. So this has been named TB. Okay, and then for our COA, we have the table design also here. It has been named COA. We use these names in Power Query. So what you need to do is stand in the table. We are going to take this to Power Query. So you click on the data tab and you load this into Power Query using this icon. So I'll click on the from table/range icon. Okay, so this gives me the initial query called TB. So we have our account code, our account, and then we have the 12 months for the trial balance going all the way from January to December. Now in Power Query, we need to work on the structure of this query. We have account code and then we have account, but we need the details of the date and the amount in just 2 columns instead of 12 columns spread across. So to correct this, we are going to do our first transformation where we unpivot the 12 columns to our right. So let's select account code, shift right to select account. Then you gently right click these two and we'll choose unpivot other columns, right? So what it's basically going to do is it's going to collapse the 12 column for the date and the amount into 2 columns, making our data longer, which is preferred. So we have attributes which represent the dates, right? So let's name this date, and then we have values here which should be our amount. So you can rename these, right? So what we need to now do is to ensure that the data type is correctly formatted. So for dates, we have to format it as a proper date. So I'll come here to the date column, select the ABC, and then format using this date format, right? Now, depending on the date structure and the system you are using, it may or may not get it right. So if you look closely, what we expected was the first day of each month. So this should be 1st January, this should be 1st February. For my date format, it rather formatted this as 23rd January and 23rd February, right? So we need to correct this. So what we are going to do is, I'm going to reverse this step, and to make it easier, I'm going to add a prefix that is the first of each month to this. We can do that in Power Query. So I've selected the date column. I'll come to transform. Then here, under the format icon, I'm going to add a prefix. So I'll click on add a prefix. So consistently, I'm going to put 1-. Okay. So this is going to add the 1- for the beginning of the period. So I have a full date to apply the format to. So now that this has been done, I can click on this and apply the date format. And as expected, I now have the correct labels here. So this in my format is 1st January and 1st February for each of the lines. So this is going to be the first transformation for our initial trial balance query. Now that we've done this, let's bring in our chart of accounts. Now, if you click on the query and you go to the first step, which is the source, you notice that it brought in the query using the name of the table, right? So clicking on the source would expose the M code in the formula bar. So select this and copy. We are going to use this to bring the chart of accounts table. So to start a new query, you can right click on the left pane. This allows you to access a new query. In other sources, you have access to a blank query. So I'll click on blank query, paste the original M code. So reading this, you realize that the variable we need to change is the name here, TB. So I'll come in here, select it. This is case sensitive. You remember in the name of the table, it was uppercase C, lowercase o, and then uppercase A, right? So that's the chart of accounts. So enter this correctly, and then you press enter. So this should now bring your chart of accounts. So we can rename it chart of accounts as we have it here. Now let's check the data type. So everything seems all right. We have basically text columns. Okay, so there isn't much we are going to do here. Now, what we are going to do is, out of this original TB query, we have all the trial balance numbers, but we need to go through some actions, typical end of year. So the first thing we are going to do is to close the accounts. Then once we close the accounts, we calculate the profit for each month. Then we'll create a retained earnings calculation out of that, and then go ahead and then post these two adjustments to the original trial balance. Because we are going to do a series of duplicates, we want to keep this original trial balance intact and then create copies of it and then use it for our subsequent queries. So to do that, I'm going to name this reference. Okay. So this allows us to create copies of the original trial balance. So because of what we are going to do, we'll create 3 copies. So the original trial balance, the query for closing accounts, and then the query for calculating the retained earnings. So let's do that. I'll right click this and then I'll reference this. So this will be for the adjusted trial balance. I'm going to name this TB because we take this as a trial balance going forward. Then I'll come here again and then right click, then choose reference. So this is going to be what we are going to use to close the accounts, right? So I'll give it a name to make it easier for us to identify. And then finally, I'll create the final reference here, which is going to be for retained earnings. Right. So at the end of the day, what we hope to achieve is that we'll create 3 columns with the same headers. And then once we work on the closed accounts and the retained earnings, we'll append whatever we've calculated in these last 2 to our adjusted trial balance. Then we'll take this trial balance going forward to the data model to do our calculations. Okay, so first let's come to our closed accounts. So we have our account code, account, date, and amount. Basically, what we do when we close accounts is to pass an adjustment to basically run all accounts to 0, right? So if we switch the signs for each of the income statement lines, then basically we are wiping all the accounts to 0. But before we do that, remember that from the chart of accounts or the trial balance, we have income statement and balance sheet lines. So first we need to filter just for the income statement lines. We'll do that at the account code section. So I'll go to the filter icon, then come to number filters. So based on the chart of accounts, you realize that all the accounts less than 10,000 are income statement lines. So I'll come here and then filter for accounts that are less than, right? I'll enter the value 10,000. Okay. So when I do it this way, I'm confident that I'm dealing with only the income statement lines. Now that we've done this, we come and we now turn the sign. So I'm going to multiply through by -1. So I'll come here under transform. There's a standard icon. I'm going to multiply this by -1. So I reverse the values. So this is basically going to net off with the original trial balance values over here, which will give us 0 for each of the income statement lines. So that completes our closed accounts query. We'll come back and append this to the trial balance. Now let's go to the retained earnings. So again, for the retained earnings, we need to basically aggregate all the income statement lines to calculate our profit or loss for each month. But before we do that, we need to filter only the income statement lines. So first, I'll come to account code, come to number filters, and then we'll again filter this for less than 10,000. Right, so if I have this, then I'm just working with the income statement lines. Now, to be able to calculate the profit for each month, we want to group by month. Okay, so I have a date column here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the date column, right click, and group by. Group by basically is like sum if. So when we group by and we put in the operation, it's going to sum all the minus and positive signs in the income statement lines and then give us the profit or loss for each month. Okay, so I'll choose group by. Now we are running this on the dates. That's why we selected it earlier. So the new column name that is going to be created, we are going to call it amount. And the operation we are going to do is to sum the original amount column, right? So this is going to give us a summary. Now, if I click OK, you'll notice that I now have calculated the profits for each month, okay? So this is what we are going to post as retained earnings for each month. Now, for this table, it has to be appended to the original TB query, right? So we need to now bring in the account code and the account name. Now, for the account code for retained earnings, you will notice that if we search for it here, it's 90,000, right? So this is what we need to add to the retained earnings so that we can append easily without any extra columns. So for this purpose, I'm going to reverse this step for the filtered rows. So I'll come to the retained earnings. Now I'm going to add the 2 columns for account and account code. So we'll come to add column and we'll create the new columns using custom column, right? So I'll choose custom column. So first we want to put in the account code. Okay. Please ensure that you spelled it the same way as the original name in the TB so that you don't get extra columns. So for the account code, we are basically going to fill every cell with 90,000. Okay, so this is going to be the value for the account code. I'll go ahead and then click OK. So this is going to be for the account code. So after creating this, we need to apply the right format to the account code. We can confirm and get the same thing from the TB. So account code is a whole number, right? So we'll come here and then we'll come and format this as a whole number 1, 2, 3. Now that we have this, let's now bring in the retained earnings column. So for the retained earnings column, we'll go through the same process: add column, custom column. Then over here, we'll add account, right? So we have account code. This is going to be account. Now, this is going to be filled for each cell with retained earnings. So you bring in your double quotes and then you type retained earnings as you have it in the original TB. So this is going to be in double quotes and you click OK. So again, we make sure that the right format has been applied. This is text. So we apply the text over here. Okay, so we are set. We have our retained earnings for each month: date, amount, account code, and account. As for the order, it doesn't have to be the same, but the column headers should have the same titles, right, to make it easier to append. So now that we have this, we need to now create the cumulative sum, right? So for retained earnings, we roll over and then add till the end of the year. This has calculated for each month, but we need it to accumulate for the periods in the year. So to do that, we are going to create a custom M code that will help us create the cumulative sum for our retained earnings. Before we do that, we have to add an index column. An index column basically numbers your columns from 1 to the last row, or 0 if you choose. So to do that, under add column, you have the index column here. We choose from 1. So this is going to bring us this helper column, which is the index column. So basically, we are going to use this to help us sum as we go down. So I'm going to show you how we are going to apply it. Now, we are going to create a custom version of this amount column using a function called list.sum in M code. So under the add column, I'm going to initiate a custom column over here. So for this purpose, let's call this C amount for cumulative amount. Okay, I'll push this down to explain what is happening here. So in the custom column formula, we are going to start the function list.sum. Okay, so please ensure you maintain the case. So from the tooltip, you realize that it returns the sum of the items in the list. But to be able to know how to go about it, so we introduce another function list.firstN, right? So this list.firstN would now sum using the index column that we chose. So basically, if we are in row 2, that is, if you are in February, it's going to add 1 and 2. If you are in March, it will add 1, 2, and 3, all the way to December. So these are the two functions that we are going to use. Now, we need to give it our current table. Okay, so in Power Query, we give the current table using the hash. So if we use the hash, you realize that we have closed accounts and retained earnings. But for retained earnings, we are looking for this current state, which is the added index, which is the last step. Right, so instead of choosing this, we would rather add the last step. Okay, so in double quotes, you put in added index, okay, which is the last step that we have in our current table. So right after the double quote, you introduce a square bracket. Okay, so we are basically summing this column, which is the amount column here. So after the square brackets, you commit the amount column. So this is going to give us the amount that we are going to be summing, gradually going down. Then you bring a comma. Here, after the comma, we are going to now give it the index helper column. So you bring another square bracket and then you introduce the index column, right? So that is how we are going to write this formula. You close your bracket for first n and then you close your brackets for list.sum, right? So let's go through again. List.sum, open bracket, list.firstn, open bracket, hash to bring in the table that we are currently using. In double quotes, added index, which is this last step that we have here. We close that double quote, then we proceed to bring the amount column, which is this one. Then with a comma, after that, we will give it the helper column to help list.firstn to sum based on our current position, right? So if there are no errors, we'll go ahead and commit this. Okay, so if you did this correctly, you should have the cumulative amount going down. So the basic idea is that if I sum going down, I should have the cumulative amount for retained earnings. Now that we have this, we are going to delete the helper columns that we brought in. So I'm going to highlight this column for amount, come all the way, hold Control, highlight index. While these two are selected, I'll right click and remove these two columns. Okay. Now we need to rename the C amount to the original amount column. Okay. Ensure that the format is formatted as a decimal number, just as we had it in the trial balance. So this is now the completed retained earnings. We have our date, account code, account, and amount. So now that we have this, we are now going to append our closed account query, our retained earnings query to the original trial balance. So you select the trial balance, then we'll come to home and we'll choose append queries. So we'll choose the original append queries because we want to maintain the first TB at the top and then follow it down with closed accounts and retained earnings. So we choose append queries. We get to choose how many tables we are adding here. So we choose 3 or more tables. Now you notice that our original TB is on standby. So first we are going to add the closed accounts. So we'll push it here, and then we'll add our retained earnings. We'll push it here as well. So we have our TB, closed accounts, retained earnings, and I'll click OK. So if we did this right, we should have the original 4 columns. What's going to happen is that the ones that we brought in will be appended at the bottom of the table. We'll check out if we got this right when we create our final pivot tables, which should give us 0 at the end. Right. So we've completed our adjusted trial balance. Now let's create the dimension table for dates. Right. So we'll create a calendar table, basically giving us the timeline for our trial balance. So we'll grab the earliest dates and then go all the way to the latest date so that we have a comprehensive list of dates. So to do that, we'll start a blank query. I'll right click, new query. Then we come to other sources and then we'll launch a blank query here. We are going to create a calendar table with a custom M code. So number.from. So basically what it's going to do is to stamp a start date. Okay. Now that start date is going to be the minimum date in our trial balance query. So we introduce list.min. Okay. Then we'll point it to the trial balance table, which is TB, square brackets, and then we put in dates. Make sure your case is right. So this is date, and then we'll close our brackets for list.min and then number.from. So what it's basically going to do is grab 1st January 2023, which is our earliest date. To get the latest date, we are going to create a sequence of dates. So I'm going to copy this original one, put in 2 dots for the series, and then paste this other side. Right. So for the timeline, instead of list.min, we are going to choose list.max for the other side. Now you will notice that if we are going by a trial balance dates, which basically has the 1st of every month, this will cap at 1st December. Right. If you want to go all the way to 31st December, you can adjust this by +30. Right. Otherwise, you can keep it at 1st December. This will work. We only need the month names, okay, from our calendar table. So this is our full formula. Before we press enter, we'll put this in curly brackets for our list. So curly brackets to begin and then curly brackets to close. Okay. So if you have this, you just press enter. So this should give us 365 dates from the original list that we have. This is a list, so we are going to convert it to a table. We'll click to table and we'll click OK. Now we need to format this properly, so I'll click on the ABC123, format this as a date. Right, so we have 1st January going all the way down to 31st December. This is going to be date. Now for our final dashboard, we basically need the month names. So I'm going to name this properly. I'm going to call this calendar. Okay, so now that we have this, we need to draw the date attributes that we will need in our final dashboard. So I'll come to add column, then using the date icon, I'll draw first the month values. Okay, this will give me 1 to 12, which we'll use to sort our months. Then select the date again, and I'll come to the date icon, come to month. This time round, I'll draw the name of month. So this gives me January to December, right? Now, for our slicer, we need these month names to be shortened. So while we are here, I'll select the month name, go to transform, and we are going to extract just the first 3 characters from here. So I'll click on first 3 characters and put in 3 for count, and we should now have our month name abbreviated, right? So we've basically covered all the things that we need to do in our Power Query. From this point onwards, we are going to load all these queries as connections. Truth is that we only need the adjusted trial balance, the chart of accounts, and the calendar table. The rest are going to be helper queries. So we'll load them as connections and disconnect them from going to the data model, and then we'll move on from there. So while we are here, I'll come to home, choose close and load to the second option. Then we'll come here and choose to hold this as a connection. So doing this keeps it in memory, so you can later come back and then reload to the data model. So I'll choose only create a connection, and then I'll go ahead and load them as connections. So now that these have been loaded, we'll go ahead and commit the queries that we need to the data model. So first is the chart of accounts. So I'll right click this and change the load to add this to the data model. This is where we are going to connect the tables. Okay, so this first one is going to be loaded. Then I'll come to my adjusted trial balance. Again, choose load to, then add this to the data model. Click OK. So this has been loaded. Then finally, I'll also load my calendar. So I'll load this as well to the data model. Click OK. Okay, so if you have created this, then basically we are now ready to go to Power Pivot with these 3 queries. So now that we have these 3, we need to enable Power Pivot. If you are new to Power Pivot, it sits as an add-in, but you have to activate it. Okay, so this is my Power Pivot. It's already activated. If yours is not activated, you enable it for the first time by coming to data. Then in the data tools group, you see the icon here to manage the data model. You click on it once, it opens the Power Pivot window. Once you close it, you should see the Power Pivot tab here. Right, so this is how we are going to access the data model. So this is Power Pivot. Then I'll select it and come to manage. So I'll click on manage. So as I expected, we see the 3 tables, chart of accounts, trial balance, and calendar. This is the data view of Power Pivot. So we are going to switch to the diagram view. So this is going to give us our 3 tables. So in essence, the trial balance is going to be our fact table, okay, where we are going to create our measures from. These 2, the chart of accounts and calendar, are going to be our dimension tables. So we need to connect them so that the slicer that we connect to the chart of accounts and calendar will be able to break down all the calculations we do in the trial balance. So for account code, this is my foreign key. I'm going to connect this to the primary key here for chart of accounts. Then for the calendar, this date is the primary key. I'm going to connect this to the foreign key here. So we've basically created our star schema. So this is what is going to drive all our calculations. So now that we've done this, let's do a little sorting on our calendar table. So if you come to the calendar table, the third table here, if you click on it, we have month name. Okay, so this month name is going to be used to break down our changes in working capital. We need it sorted correctly. So that is why we brought the month value here. So we'll choose sort by column. Okay, so if you select the month name, we'll choose the sort by column, and we'll sort this by the month column, the one that contains 1 to 12, so that it can order it chronologically because January is 1 and December is 12 in that case. So we do this once, we don't have to come back here. So this is going to apply to the data model. So we're essentially done. We can now go ahead and create our pivot tables. So I'm going to exit the Power Pivot window and enable content. So at this point, let's start creating our pivot tables. So to create our pivot tables, we need to insert a new sheet. So this sheet, we are going to call this calculations. Now, over here, we are going to insert our first pivot table from our data model. So I'll come to insert pivot table from the data model that we just created. So I'll click on this and then put it in the existing worksheet. Now, if you know how pivot tables work, it's easier to start with the value section. So we aggregate that using our trial balance. So the 3 tables that we saw in the data model are on top: calendar, chart of accounts, and TB. These are the original tables. We are not going to be working with these 2. Right, so we open up the TB and then we draw amount over here. Right, so for starters, if we got all our calculations correct, our trial balance should give us 0. Okay, so this is a test that at least we got it correct. So if we have this, we can now break it down by any of the labels in the chart of accounts. So we come to the chart of accounts. Let's start off with category. So if we draw this by category, we have the high categories for the income statement and the balance sheet, still giving us 0. Right, so for this case study, we just want to focus on the balance sheet. So we can now draw the income statement or balance sheet field in the chart of accounts to filters. So we'll take this and then put it in filters. So over here, we now have the opportunity to just select the balance sheet lines, okay, so that we only have the assets, equity, and liabilities. Okay, now that we have this high level, we can now add the subcategory. So I'll add this to the pivot table, which breaks down the assets and equity. Then I can also add the detailed accounts for each line. Okay, so we have something like this. Right, so this gives us our initial balance sheet. So we realize that because of the chart of account arrangement, is sorted properly from assets, equity to liabilities. So this is just a quick check-in to see how you are doing. I'm sure you've enjoyed what you've learned so far. Excel's BI tools can do far more than what you've seen. Power Query, Power Pivot, DAX, Cube Functions, and all that. If you are new to these tools, I would like to recommend my book, Data Modeling with Microsoft Excel. So you can get a hard copy here in Ghana, or you can buy online using the Amazon link that has been shared on the screen. So this will give you a step-by-step guide with practical case studies to help you master these tools. So let's continue. At this point, let's see how we can put it all together to create our final dashboard. Okay, so now that we've drawn our pivot tables, we basically need to make sense of what these numbers are. Right, so to get some idea on what the numbers represent, let's add the months as columns. So I'll come here and then push month names in the columns. Now you'll notice that as we go month on month, right, it indeed is giving us the lines, the amount for each line in the balance sheet, right? But the numbers that we were seeing were grand totals. In the scheme of things, this is not going to be useful. the balance sheet numbers are always as at a certain point. So if I select December, I should get these numbers. If I select, let's say, August, the latest numbers should always show. So we need to now modify these numbers in such a way that if we put in our slicers for the month and we select a particular period, it gives us the latest. Okay, so I'm going to reverse the pivot table and then take back the month names. So instead of the month names as columns, I'm rather going to insert a slicer on month names. So I'll insert a slicer inside the pivot table right here, and I'm going to choose month name and I'll click OK. So basically what we want to achieve is this, that if I select December, right, this should give me the December numbers. If I select August, this should give me the August numbers. And if I don't select anything, what you saw in December is what should show. Okay, not the total you saw in the pivot tables. So we need to create a measure that always brings the latest month, the numbers for the latest month that has been selected. So we're going to create our first DAX measure. Now to create that measure, we'll go to Power Pivot, then we'll come to measures right here, and then we'll start a new measure. So we can decide which table will host our measures. In some cases, we can create a dedicated table, but because we have only one fact table, we'll put it in the trial balance table. So we are going to call this current because we want to create current and previous for each balance sheet line. Okay, so we'll call this one current and use it to create the previous when we are done. So let's first create our DAX measure. So to calculate the current, we are going to use the DAX function calculate, which basically is going to sum the TB amount. Okay, so this is going to be our expression, and we are going to apply a filter to this. So I'll do a shift enter, and then we'll introduce the filter. So the filter basically is going to work on the calendar table. So this is the calendar table, right? Now what we want here is for the month that we have selected, okay, which basically will be the highest month, we want the numbers as at that point. Okay, so we would now bring in the calendar month, the column, right, and say that this should be equal to the maximum, which is what we have selected in the calendar month, right? So this is going to be our DAX formula. So I'll close this function, and then I'll close this for our filter, and then close this for our calculate function, right? So this formula is going to return the latest. If you have not selected any month at all, it will push it all the way to December, right? So that is our DAX formula. I'm going to check if everything is okay. Looks okay, and we'll format this using 1000 separator to 2 decimal place, and we'll click OK. Okay, so you realize that this is now going to show the latest, which is the December number. So if I click on December, we now have the two side by side. So we are going to go forward using this current version and do away with the implicit measure sum of amount. Okay, so let's take this out. So now that we have this, we can use this to calculate the previous, right? So what I basically want to do is, if I select, let's say February, I should see January's number in the next column. Okay, so to do that, we are going to create another DAX measure. So we'll come to Power Pivot, Measures, New Measure. We'll maintain this in the trial balance, and again we are going to use calculate. So calculate would require an expression to modify using filters. We'll give it what we just calculated, which is the current measure. Okay, and we'll now apply our measure. So this is going to be a time intelligence function called date add. So for date add, we basically need to commit the calendar date column. Okay, bring a comma to specify the intervals. We are going back 1 month, so -1. Okay, and then the denomination is going to be month. Okay, so this is what we have. So I'll close my brackets for calculate, for date add, and then close my brackets for calculate. Okay, so this is our formula. We check if everything is fine. We format it as we did, and then we use 1,000 separator for this, and we'll click OK. So let's test and see if this is working. Okay, so this is coming in as measure 1. We forgot to name our measure. So again, to add to the learning, let's go back and see how we edit measures. Still under Power Pivot, we come to measures, then you go to manage measures. So we'll come here. This is measure 1. We'll edit this and we'll call this previous. Okay. So you can always come back and edit your measures. So we'll just click OK and then we'll close. This should update. Now let's test and see if this is working. So for February, these should be January numbers. So pay close attention. If I come to March, so this number should go to the previous, and so on. April, right? Then in January, we shouldn't get any previous because there's nothing to compare with, right? So this should now give us the option to compare our balance sheet lines, current and previous. This is going to be the main work or staging for our dashboard. So now that we are done, we can fill in the subtotals, okay, so that we can eyeball our calculations. So I'll come to the design tab in the pivot table, come to subtotals and show all subtotals at the top of group. So we have something like this. Okay, so we are done with the main pivot tables. Now, if you look at the final work, we basically need to calculate the current assets, current liabilities, and working capital, previous and current. Then we also need to calculate the debt to equity. But before we do debt to equity, we need to draw the calculations for assets, liabilities, and equity, right? Now that we have this pivot table, all these can be done smoothly using cube functions, right? So let's go back and then stage the calculations for our cube functions. So before we do that, I want to give you the architecture of how we are going to approach this. So for starters, we are going to have our current numbers here and then our previous numbers here. But instead of keeping these as regular text, we can create what we call cube members from them. So cube members basically would access a particular side of the data model so that we don't have to write long formulas to retrieve our calculations. So if you look closely, current and previous are measures that we calculated. We just completed them. So we are going to use this to create cube members. So let's proceed and create that. So I'll stand here. There are basically 7 cube members. So we use about 6 of them, right? So these are the cube functions. The ones that we are going to use here is the cube member. Okay. Now for each cube function, we have to introduce the data model. So after the open bracket, you bring a double quote, which should now bring the data model. You close the double quote. Now for the member expression, we need to show where the calculation that we did sits. So we'll bring in a double quote, which will bring all the sides of our data model. So we have our calendar, chart of accounts, measures, and then our trial balance. So this is from the measures side. We'll bring a dot, okay, and we have our current calculation here. So I'll draw this and I'll close this. Okay, so this is going to be for the current calculation. So when we bring in the member expression, we basically need to close our brackets, and this is going to draw the member, which is the measure current. So now that we've done this, we just have to copy this, right? Control R, and we know what we have to do. Come in here and then change current to previous. Okay, when you commit this, please back out the second square bracket. We only need 1 square bracket here, so this should give us previous. Okay, so we have our current and we have our previous. So we now need to bring in our current assets, our current liabilities, and then work out our working capital. using the same method. So we just basically need to know where our current assets and current liabilities sits, right? So equal to cube member. We'll draw the data model again. This time around, if you look closely at the chart of accounts, right, the current asset sits in the subcategory column. So we'll commit the subcategory column. We'll bring a dot and we'll bring a square bracket and then put in current assets. Please spell this correctly. So we close our square brackets and then we'll close our double quote. So this is going to stamp the name for our current assets. We'll close this and we have current assets here. Then I'll copy this down and basically change this from current assets to current liabilities. So from these two, we are going to create our working capital. Now, what we basically want to do is to draw the numbers that correspond to these cube members or labels. So if I stand here, I'm looking for the current number for current assets. Okay. If I move this here, is the previous for current assets. Now we can basically retrieve this using another cube function called cube value. Okay, so if I put in the data model with a double quote, at this point, I just select the two expressions. So current, because I want to copy this right and down, I'm going to lock this at row level. Okay, bring a comma and then select current assets and also lock this at column level. Okay, while I'm here, I can actually add the slicer for month so that this slicer can actually filter the numbers that we are calculating. So I'll put in the slicer month name and then I'll close my bracket. Right, so if we got this right, it should give us the current asset value. Let's go back and see. So for current assets, we have 5450353. Right, our slicer should be able to update this. Okay, so that is what we want to achieve. So now that we have this, we can easily copy this down. So select this, Control R. Okay, then come down, shift down, Control D. Okay, so this is what we have. Now, if we use our slicers, we don't want the column width to auto fit, right? So we need to change that behavior. I don't want a situation where you're always adjusting the columns if you click on a slicer. So we can quickly fix that by selecting any of the cells in the pivot table, right click, and then we go to pivot table options. Then we deactivate the auto fit column width on update. Okay, so this should make sure that the column width stays as we want it. So now that we have this, let's calculate our working capital. So our working capital is going to be a sum of these two. So alt equal to, and I'm going to format this, then copy this to the right. Okay. So we've basically created the staging for this particular chart. So this is what we are going to use to draw our chart. So now that we've created this, let's go ahead and then draw the key numbers, which is our assets, our liabilities, and our equity. Then use that to calculate our debt to equity ratio, which is going to be for this visual, right? So using the same method, we are going to copy the cube member. Okay, then paste this here. Now we need to make just a little change. So for assets sits in the category section. So instead of subcategory, I'll choose category and then edit this to assets. Okay, so this is going to ensure that I'm able to draw the total assets for our calculation. So this is done. Then I'm going to copy this down and then edit this side to liabilities. So just ensure that you spell these correctly. And then finally, we have equity. Okay, so going by the same structure, if I copy this formula, because this has been locked, I should now be able to get total assets, total liabilities, and equity. So I'm going to copy this and then just highlight the range over here and then paste. Okay, so if we did this correctly, if we check total assets for the latest month is 7694 and so on, right? Now, this is going to be used to calculate our debt to equity. So for the purposes of this calculation, we are going to make the equity calculation absolute. Okay, so we'll just take off the minus sign by putting a minus sign over here. So this is going to be our balance sheet check. We can even put in a check here, which is going to be a sum of these. Okay, and if you subtract equity, you should get 0. Okay, so this should give us that. So this completes the calculation for the main lines. Now, the reason we did this was to be able to calculate the long-term loans, which is going to be the numerator for our debt to equity ratio. So again, using the same method, Control C, I'll paste this here. So because I want long-term loans in the chart of accounts, I'm going to edit the category to the account column. Okay, so this is going to be the column that we are going to use. Ensure you have only one closing square bracket. So for what I'm looking for, so if I come to the chart of accounts in the account column, right, I'm looking for long-term loans, right? So I'm going to type this as you see there, long-term loans. Okay, so this is going to be my cube member. Now we do this to just make our calculations easy. Okay, so if I have this and I copy and paste this here, the expectation is that this should draw the same number we had in our data model. Okay, now that we have this, let's now calculate our debt to equity. So our debt to equity is going to be our long-term debts. I'm putting a minus sign to neutralize this, divided by our equity, right? So this should give us 70%. We'll come back here and then modify this a bit for our final visual. So if you look at our final visual, this is what we are going to use to create this visual. Okay, so we'll come back and then modify this a bit. So essentially, we've taken care of the pivot table, we've taken care of the working capital, we've taken care of the debt to equity ratio. What is left is to create the staging for our changes in working capital. So we need to be able to break down the current assets and current liabilities we created here by month. Okay, so first we'll bring in our cube sets. So first let's draw our months. So to be able to get the months, we are going to create another cube formula called cube set. So it basically stores a series of labels we can use to create our summary in a single cell. Okay, so we have 12 months. So the cube set here, okay, is going to store all the names of the 12 months in a single cell. We later use that to stage our final summary. So this is going to be the, so we'll bring in the workbook data model with a double quote. Okay, then the set expression, which side in our data model our date sits in, is set in the calendar. Okay, specifically under month name, but because we want all of it, I'll bring a dot and then put in children. Okay, then we put in our double quote. So this is going to give us all the names of the months in one cell. Then for our caption, I have an option to, instead of leaving this blank, I'll call this months in double quotes. Okay, so this is going to give me the month. Just to be sure, let's just count how many we have here. Again, using another cube set, another cube function called cube set count. Okay, so cube set count basically needs a set, which is what we just calculated here. So this should give us 12 months. Now, you see why we created this very soon. What we basically want is to create a spell of the 12 months, January to December, right? Then we will be able to easily stage our working capital changes. So to do that, we'll use another cube function. So this is going to expose you to most of the cube functions, which most people don't use, but it offers a lot of flexibility, especially when it comes to drawing your measures from the data model. So here we are going to use a cube function called cube ranked member. Okay, so for all cube functions, you start with the double quote for the data model. Okay, so our set expression is going to be what we calculated here, that single cell that contains all the 12 months. And we'll go to rank after the comma. So rank basically brings the particular month or the item in the set, okay, based on the position. So if I put in 1, it should give me January, 2, February, and so on. But in this case, we don't want a single month. We want all the 12 months. So I'm going to add a function, a dynamic array function called sequence. So sequence would use this 12 that we calculated here to spell all the 12 months across. So instead of doing it by row, I'm going to skip. I'll put in a comma. Okay. Then select this for the number of columns that we need. Okay. So that's basically will give us January to December. I'll close for sequence and I'll close for cube rank member. So if I did this correctly, it should now give us January to December as we have it here. Okay. So the reason we created this was to be able to stage our current assets and current liabilities. So I'm going to copy the current assets and current liabilities and then bring it down here. So basically what I need is to create that summary table, Alt HBA. Okay, so this is going to calculate the current assets for each month and current liabilities. Then we'll work out our working capital, and then from then we'll do our changes. So we can actually bring in this measure, the one that calculates the current assets for the latest month. So I'm going to copy this, Control C, and then paste this here. Okay, now let's do a little modification. First of all, we don't need the slicer month name, so I'm going to back this off because we already have a month at the top that is slicing this for us. So this is our original data model. This measure, which is C28, is what we need. So going to the right, we want to lock this absolutely, not just at row level. So I'm going to add another $sign here. So we'll lock this current asset label here. Okay, so that is going to be at column level, which we are going to maintain. Then instead of the slicer for the month, which we just deleted, we'll point it to this label, which will now give us the breakdown for January. So this one I'm going to lock at row level so that the columns can move to the right. Right, so that's a little modification. We expect this to give us the current assets for January. So now that we have this, I'll take this all the way to the right, Control R, Alt HOI to expand this for December. And we should easily shift down, Control D to get the same calculation for current liabilities. Right, so just as we did earlier, we can now calculate working capital, which is going to be an Alt equal to on this, and then take this all the way to December, Control R. Okay, so we've basically broken down what we did earlier by month so that we can get the changes in working capital. So now that I've broken down working capital by month, I can come and calculate the changes. So for the first month is 0. So I'm putting this for our chart. Then for February going forward, it's going to be current month minus the previous month. Okay, so this is going to be a relative calculation going all the way to December. Okay, so this is what we are going to use for this final chart. So now that we've created this, the stage is set for our final visualization. Okay, so now the stage is set for us to do our final dashboard. We've basically created a backstage for our pivot tables, the debt to equity ratio, the working capital, and changes in working capital. So we are bringing this to the front, and then we'll create the charts to communicate these. So first, let's start with the pivot table. So I need to basically copy the entire pivot table, but because it has a filter section, I cannot do a Control A. So the best way to do this is to select. So if you have selected any part of the pivot table, you come to pivot table, analyze, then use the select icon to select the entire pivot table. It's a better way to do this. So I'll copy, hit the plus sign here. Now while I'm here, I'm going to select B5 and then paste the pivot table. So we can double click to expand and then fit the content. So this is what we have. Now we are going to design this in a dark mode, right? So it's good to set the stage now for your dark mode. So what we are basically going to do is to paint or fill the background of our worksheets with the color that we are going to use. So this is the gray color that we are going to use. So the hex code for this has been posted in the video. You can use that. So it's a gray color. So once you put this in, we can take advantage of the selection and then paint and then make the font white. Okay. So this is going to set the stage for this. While we are here, we are going to highlight the filter row. Okay, so we'll highlight this, right click, and then we hide this. Okay, so it's still going to work if it's hidden. So this is going to be the staging for our pivot table. We can select the pivot table, come to the pivot table design, and then in the pivot table styles, we choose the second version, okay, with the white lines, right, to make it a bit more consistent. So we now have the staging for our current and our previous. Now at this point, it will be good to calculate the variance. Okay, so you notice that we have our variance calculated in column E. This has to be a measure. It basically is calculating for asset lines, current minus previous, and then for liability and equity lines, is calculating previous minus current to give us their respective variance. So for this, we need to create a special measure for that, and then we'll apply a conditional formatting on that. So let's go to Power Pivot. We'll come to measures and then we'll create a new measure. So for this, we are going to call it variance. Right. Now our formula, if it was a regular Excel formula, would be just as I stated. If the selection from chart of accounts is an asset, then we do current minus previous. Otherwise, give us previous minus current. Right. If it was Power BI, we could have used the DAX function selected value, but it's currently not present in Excel. So we are going to do a modified version of that. So we need to first wrap all we are going to do with one function called has one value. This has to be met first. Okay, so we are going to say that if whatever we are going to select, that is from the chart of accounts, the category section, okay, has one value, okay, then we would trigger the true value. So we are going to wrap this first, has one value, we close our bracket, then we'll bring a comma. Then we'll proceed to generate the result if this is true. So if this has one value, the next logic, shift enter, is another if statement, okay, that now brings in values. Okay, so it returns one column or table that contains a distinct value in a column. We are basically looking for situations where the selected category is an asset, right? So if this value selected again from the COA category, so if the value selected from this chart of accounts category, I'll close the value set, is equal to assets. So if our selected category is equal to assets in the category section, that's basically what we are trying to do here. Then the calculation that should follow is current minus previous. Okay. Otherwise, we turn it previous minus current. So this is going to take care of this if statement. Then we revert to the original has one value, right? If it doesn't have one value, we basically want a blank. Okay, so that is how we are going to run this, right? So first we need to ensure that what we have has one value. If it has one value, then the true for that is going to be this formula. Okay, otherwise it should return a blank, right? In that formula, we are basically testing if the selected category is an asset, then it should run current minus previous, otherwise previous minus current, right? So that is the explanation. So let's check and be sure that this formula is correct. So there are no errors here. We will format this as a number using 1000 separator, so to 2 decimal places, and we'll go ahead and commit this. So if we did this correctly, then we should have example for cash. Our current is 3.9. Our current is 3.930. Our previous was 3993. So the variance is a drop of minus 62,000, right? So this is going to be what we are going to use to create our data bars. So we are going to draw the variance a second time in the pivot table. So I'm here in the pivot table, analyze. I'll engage the field list, and right in the trial balance, I'm going to draw the variance a second time. Okay, so this version is what we are going to run the data bars on. So I'm going to highlight the range, then go to home, conditional formatting, then we are going to use the data bars, but we are starting it as a new row. Okay, so we select this just to be sure we have the right range selected. Then in the format style, we'll choose data bar, right? Select show bar only, and for the default field, instead of the blue color, we are using this green. And then we'll go and set the color for the negative value. So it's currently red, but I prefer this soft red. So I'll come to more colors. Again, the hex code for that is on the screen. So we'll choose this one and then we'll click OK. Right. So this is the setting for our data bar. So we'll click OK and we should have something like this. So in the event where cash went down, we should have a negative red to the left. So this is our staging for the pivot table. Let's do some changes at the top. So for instead of row labels, let's call this account. So we'll call this account, and we can center the headings correctly. Okay. Then instead of having variance 2, we can just clean this. We can't delete it, but we can put a space here to make it a bit clean. So this basically gives us the staging for our pivot table. Now that we have this, let's bring in our slicers. So for our slicers, so it's currently in our calculation sheet. We'll select it, cut. Okay. When you cut, your calculation should go off temporarily. So once you come and then you paste it, your calculation should come back. We'll paste everything here. Okay, so we have something like this. Now let's format our slicer. So in the slicer contextual tab, we put in 12 columns for this. Okay, and then we stretch it all the way. So in this case, we'll have all our 12 months spread across to the right. So this is going to be our slicer. So we now need to format it in such a way that we will have the colors for the background blend in. Okay, so let's go through how to format the slicer to let it blend in nicely with our dashboard. Okay, so to format our slicer, the first thing that we need to do is to duplicate. Okay, so we need to create a version of what exists. So we'll right click this and then we'll create a duplicate. Now we can name this. So let's name this FineX. We basically have to format just the first 4 elements and we should be fine. So the whole slicer refers to the container, the background, and the font style and all that. So if I select this, I click on format, Okay, so for the fill, it's currently set to no color, but because we want it to be transparent, if you like, or blend in with our background, we are going to set the fill with the same color. So I'll come to more colors and then come to custom, and we'll put in the hex code. Again, it's on the screen. Okay, so this would ensure that it blends in nicely with our background. We'll take off the border lines, so we'll choose none, and then we'll maintain the font for the whole slicer. Right, so those are the changes we'll do. Then we'll proceed and go to the header. So the header will be this header name and then the line that you see here. So again, we'll come here and then make the font white. And then for the border line, we can choose to make it white and then select the type of line. Okay, and then we'll leave the fill as it is. Okay, no color, and we'll click OK. So for the selected item with data, which are the buttons here, when we select data, we want it to be blue with a white font as we have it here. So I'll go in there, I'll change this fill to this blue, borderline none, and then the font is going to be white. Okay, so those are the changes. You can get a preview of what's going on in here. Right, you can format the rest, but from experience, these should suffice for now. So if this is done, I'll go in and then I'll click OK. Instantly, you won't see the effect, but you have to come to slicer and apply this. Okay, so you have something like this, which basically blends in nicely. We can change the header. Instead of month name, we need something more intuitive. So let's do select month as a slicer caption. Right, so if we now select this, you realize that it gives us our balance sheet as at the time that we have selected this. Okay, so now that we've done this, let's now calculate the debt to equity ratio. What we did here is we used the Waffle chart to represent the 70%. Right, so for that, if you look closely, you realize that the Waffle chart is 20 columns by 5 rows, right? Equally spaced. Okay, so starting from column H, we'll go all the way 20, right? So 20 would end. So if you select all the way to this point, you can reduce the format, right? So under home, cells, format, right? Column width, you can set this to 2.5. Okay, so the shortcut is Alt HOW, right? So this will now bring all the columns to the same width. Now for the 20 columns, I'm going down 5 rows, so 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now let me put some border lines, Alt HBA, around here so that you see each block. Okay, so I have 100 boxes or cells in here. So this is what we are going to use to stage our Waffle chart. Now basically what I want to do is to fill these with a series of numbers 1 to 100. Okay, so we are going to use the dynamic array function sequence. Okay, so sequence is going to take 5 rows and then 20 columns. Okay, we'll leave the optional ones, start and step. Okay, so if I do it, I get something like this, right? So this should give us 1 to 100. Now this is very useful. It's going to help us highlight the range that our percentage falls within, right? It starts from the top 1 to 100, but I'm going to reorder so that the bottom part comes up. So for this, I'm going to use sort, which is another dynamic array function. So for sort, I am sorting the sequence. Okay, I'll skip the sort index. I don't need it here. Then bring another comma for the sort order, which is going to be -1 descending. Okay, so I'll close this. So this is now going to give me 1 climbing all the way up to 100. If you don't have dynamic array functions, you probably want to find a manual way to fill in the numbers in this order. Right, so this is going to set the stage, but we don't need these numbers to be visible. So I'm going to basically highlight this. Okay, press Ctrl 1 and then under the custom, I'm going to hide the numbers. So I'll put in a custom code, semicolon, semicolon, semicolon 3 times. Okay. So this is going to blank these values, but they are still present. Okay. So while these are selected, we basically need to put in a conditional format. That conditional format is going to say that if this 70% that we've calculated here, okay, so it's going to use the 70% as a cap, right? This is in percentages, so I'm going to create the absolute version of this by multiplying this by 100. So I'll go and create this. So this is what we are going to use as basis for our conditional format. So if any number falls from 0 to or 1 to 70, we want it colored. Basically that, right? So this is highlighted. I'll go to home, come to conditional formatting, then we'll start a new rule, then format only cells that contain. So this is going to show us the option to put in the range. So cell value between, if you like, 0, and now this is where we need to go and calculate the cap, that is the debt to equity ratio that we have calculated. So I'll come here and then come to my calculation and pick this absolute number, right? So if I come here, I've set the range. Now I want this colored using a simple gray fill, right? So I'll come to the fill and then choose this middle one, if you like, okay, and then I'll click OK. So this is going to be this is going to be the fill for this, and then I'm going to click OK, right? So this is going to fill our debt to equity, right? It responds to our slices, as you can see. Okay, so if let's say in April, so you select any month, it should respond. It will be good to put in a text box to show what the percentage is. So we can insert a text box. So I'll come here, insert a simple text box right here. Okay, you can draw it in the middle. So you select it on the borderline, come to the formula bar, put in an equal to, then we go to the calculations, and this time around we'll choose the percentage version, okay, for display purposes. So this is 82%. So we'll come here and then put this in the middle, center, bolden this, and then increase the font to about 32 or 28, depending on your screen, is fine. Now while we are here, let's make the text box transparent, okay, and then take off the borderline. So we have something like this. Okay, so this is now going to show us the debt to equity for each of the months that we select. It's a rather creative way to show the percentages instead of using probably regular donut charts. Okay, so hope you learned something here. Now we've taken care of this. Let's come in and create the chart for our working capital. So our working capital chart is already staged here. So this is what we are going to use for our working capital. Now, because of the nature of the chart we are going to use, we are going to make the current liabilities positive, okay, so that we can have all the numbers in one chart. So let's make that little change here. So I'll put in a minus sign and then adjust this sum. Negate this as well, right? So this should give us the same values. I'll copy this to the right. Okay, so I'm basically going to highlight these three: current assets, liabilities, and working capital. Then I'll go to recommended charts. Okay, I normally come here to access all the charts. So what we are going to use here is a stacked bar chart. So for the stacked bar charts, we are using this version, the second one, and the second version here. Okay, so this is what we are going to use. So I'll click OK for this. So let's do an initial formatting here. I'll take off the title, take off the labels. I'll maintain a legend and take off the grid lines, and then we'll take off this axis label as well, right? So this is what we are going to use. I'm going to cut this and take this to the dashboard. So looking at the space that we've allocated for this, I'm going to fit this to align with our Waffle chart. So over here, what we need to do is to take off the fill. Okay, and while we are here, we can make the font white so that it stands out. Now, to be consistent with our colors, we are going to paint current assets green. So I'll come here and then make this green. Okay, and then for our liabilities, we are going to make it the soft red. So I'll come here and choose the soft red. And then working capital, which is what we are here for, we'll make it white. Okay, then we'll not need the border lines, so I'll come to format and take off the shape outline. Okay, so later we'll put in the captions for this. But while we are here, let's put in the data labels. So I'll add the data labels to this. Now you'll notice that we need to do some work. So for starters, let's select the data labels. So we would press Ctrl 1 to bring up the format data labels pane, right? What we are here for is to format the numbers, right? So for the label options, we are here to format the numbers. So for starters, instead of displaying this as we have it, the numbers are in millions, okay, apart from the current liabilities. We want to set a custom format for this. Okay, so under general, we'll choose custom, okay, and we'll put in this format 0.00, comma, double quotes, M, close double quotes. So this is going to shorten it and then express it in 2 decimal place in millions, okay. So it makes it easier on the eye and on the chart. So while this is selected, we can actually format this and make this black, okay, and then maybe bolden this a bit, increase the font to about 10, okay. So we'll repeat the same process for this one. So we'll come here, choose custom, right, and then make this black, bolden it, and then increase the font for this, okay. Then finally, we'll do same for our working capital, which is hidden as a white font here. So I'll press Ctrl 1, I'll come here, then set this to the custom, okay. So while this is selected, we can come back home, make this bold, make it this black, bolden this, and then increase the font, okay. So this completes the charts for working capital, okay. You could put in some shadows if you like to make it stand out, but for this purpose, we are keeping it simple, okay. So the last thing that we want to create is the changes in working capital. So this is a waterfall chart, right? So waterfall charts are usually suitable for numbers with negative and positive movement, right? So if you look at this, we staged it right here. So we have our months going across, and then we have the numbers also going down. That is the changes in working capital. So we highlight the months, hold Control, select the first one, and then you use Shift right to add the numbers to your selection. So as long as these two are selected, we can plot our chart. So I'll come to Insert, then come to Recommended Charts. So sometimes you have your charts in the recommended charts. This is the waterfall chart. A bit clumsy at the moment, but we'll fix it. Then I'll click OK. Okay, so this is going to give us the initial waterfall chart. Now for this purpose, we'll take off the chart title. We'll not need a legend because essentially there's no total to mark this against. And then we'll take off the labels to the left. Okay, so that leaves us with just the movements and the month. So I'm going to cut this, Ctrl X. I'll come here and then paste this. So I'll align this nicely so that it fits into the space that we've allocated for this. So you can align it So once we are here, and then you have this, let's now format this correctly. So I'll come to format, shape fill. So for a shape fill, we'll maintain a no fill, and then come to home, make the font white. Okay, we'll take off our grid lines. Right, now the numbers are a bit clumsy at the moment, but we can deal with it as we did with the working capital chart. So you select the numbers, you press Ctrl 1, then under the number format, you come here, change general to custom. Okay, so instead of 0.00, 2 commas for the million denomination, we'll do 0.001 comma, okay, and then make this K for the 1000 version, okay, so that we can see a bit more of the numbers. So we are going to add this. So this is going to format it in thousands, which is a K. So in this case, to reduce clutter, we'll reduce the font a bit, okay. So we have something like this. Okay, so we can now format this to take off the shape outline, okay, and then we can now set the colors. So I'm going to select this to take off the shape outline, okay, and then we can now format the colors. So to make it easier, we can temporarily bring back the legend, okay. So if we bring back the legend, okay, we can use the legend to color the movements. So for increase, I'm going to just select increase. So while this is selected, I can come to home or use this fill, right, whichever is easier. So this we are going to fill with green. So that will be for the increase. Then we'll do same for the decrease. So for the decrease, we use the soft red. Okay, so that is how we'll do this. Now at this point, we can take off the chart title. Okay, so we basically have what we are looking for. So we're almost done. All we need to do is to bring in the captions, right? So I'll push this up a bit to make room for our caption. Bring this down, okay, to make room. So I've highlighted this. So this is going to be debt to equity ratio, okay, and then for this we'll call it working capital, and then this one is going to be changes in working capital. Right, so depending on your screen, you can adjust your charts accordingly, okay. So we just need to make sure that it fits nicely. So we can now put in some lines. So I'll highlight this all the way and then put in a border line. So this is already white, okay, so I'll just highlight this as well. Shortcut is Alt HBO, and then I'll highlight this as well, Alt HBO, okay. So in the end, what we've done is to create this interactive balance sheet dashboard. Remember where we came from. You can now name your worksheet dashboard. Okay, so from this trial balance, chart of accounts, and our calculations, we've been able to create this interactive balance sheet dashboard. Now the idea is that it responds to give you the latest balance sheet numbers. Okay, it computes your variance. You can draw some of the key indicators using cube functions as I showed you. So if you want to bring or highlight any other thing, you can use that system to draw. In our case, we did debt to equity ratio, working capital, and changes in working capital. So hopefully you've taken some lessons. So even if you're not an accountant, I'm sure there are tips and tricks that we learned that you can apply to your work. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.
If this video was helpful and you would like to receive more of these videos directly on your WhatsApp, you can send ad to this WhatsApp number. We'll add you to our broadcast list so you receive our videos directly. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Finance Skills Hub. All our old videos are here. Please subscribe for notification of new videos, or connect with us on any of these social media handles. Thank you so much for watching.